Hello and welcome to my second real-time watercolour tutorial. Today I'm going to be painting a little seascape, and I quickly wanted to talk through the products or items I'm going to be using to create this painting today. I've got my little watercolour palette here. I'm going to be using just a simple sort of set of colours, so not, you know, some 36 set or whatever. I'm going to try and mix as much as I can and limit the amount of colours I'm going to use. So I have split primaries at the top here, and I'll list all the colours below, but I'll also talk through them as I use them during the painting. And then I've just got some convenience mixes down here. So we have a cool and a warm yellow, red and blue, yellow ochre, burnt sienna, burnt umber, sap green. This is a rare earth green, a mine blue and a lamp black. I won't be using all of the colours today, but that's just the palette I'm going to try and stick to for these real-time tutorials. I have some paper towel here. This one I use for just dabbing my brush off on. That's why there's so much paint all over it. I've got some clean paper towel here if I need to use it to dab away any paint or to do any lifting. I'm not sure if I'll be doing that today, but I want to have it on hand just in case. My water bucket, I've got two sides, one for dirty, one for clean. I also like to use old jars, like food jars, if you don't have a split bucket like that one. I've got my watercolour paper here. Today I'm using Aquabee, or Aquabee as I would say in Australia, watercolour paper. This one is a 300 GSM and 100% cotton. So this is my first time actually using this paper. I wanted to test it out. I've got a graphite pencil for any sketching here, or this one here as well. A T-square ruler. You don't need to have a T-square, but a ruler if you like. You don't even have to use a ruler if you don't want to, not for this painting. I've got a couple of brushes here. I've got a quill mop, a flat brush and a couple of round brushes. And I've just used some masking tape to tape down my paper just to an old, this is actually just the backing off of an old sketch pad. So I think that's it for the materials today. So let's get painting. Oh, the other thing I wanted to mention was the photograph that I'm using for reference today is linked below. This is actually a photograph I've taken myself, and that's what I'll be using as reference today. I've said it before and I'll say it again. The reference is just a guide. You know, let the reference serve you, not the other way around. So first off, I'm going to start by, I actually am going to use my ruler today just because I want my horizon line to be pretty straight. And I don't really have a lot of sky in this picture, so I almost could go without doing it. So up to you if you want to do that. I'm just going to lightly draw in a line there just to serve as my horizon line. If you look at the reference photo and follow along, the water actually is kind of at an angle when it comes onto the beach. One other thing that I'm going to use today actually that I forgot to mention is my heat tool for drying. If you're a crafter, you might have one of these heat tools. If not, if you have access to a hairdryer, those are excellent. Or otherwise you can just leave the paper to air dry, but it does slow down your process if you wanted to keep working. So that's why I have the heat tool, just to speed that up. Okay, so first I'm actually going to use my flat brush here today, and I'm just going to wet the brush up to make sure it's nice and clean. Another reason to have my paper towel here is just to dab off the excess water, but also make sure that my brush is nice and clean. So I can dab it off onto a clean part of my paper towel there. Okay, and I'm going to mix some water just with the Prussian blue today, and I'm going to keep that fairly watery. I want this to be fairly light, and I'm just going to paint in the sky. If you're having trouble getting your colours to blend, something you can do is wet the paper first. As this was such a small area, I didn't want to bother sort of with that for this bit here. I'm using a flat brush so I can just try and follow that horizon line as best I can. What I'm doing here is I just cleaned off the brush. I didn't really necessarily need to do this, but I wanted to show you. Cleaned off the brush, and just with clean water, I'm just sort of scrubbing away at that excess water, and that's where I could use that bit of paper towel to lift away. Okay, again, all that's going to be blue up here anyway because that's the water, but I just want to show you how you can lift out colour if you go at it quickly enough. If you've accidentally put colour down where you don't want it, you can to an extent remove it. There are some colours that are more staining than others, especially, for example, phthalo blue is a high staining colour, a beautiful colour, but if you wanted to lift it out, it can be a bit tricky. I'm sorry, that's the garbage truck outside. Okay, so we'll continue. So next up, I'm already noticing I've got a little bit of roughly cauliflower sort of texture up here. I don't know whether I can get the camera to focus on that just here. Okay, so that's because I didn't apply this as evenly as I should have. Okay, so what you can do is you can either try and lift some of that away while it's still wet, but as it's already made that texture now, I'm just going to do another coat, which I probably would have done another coat of the sky anyway. Basically, you want to make sure that if you see any puddles of water, to try and pull some of that excess water away, so you can lift away with just a very damp brush, like that you've taken all the excess water off and there's no water, sort of, it's only just damp, to lift that away. If you go at the paint with paper towel, for example, that's completely dry, it will take probably too much away. So, and if you've got very textured paper like this Viva watercolor paper, paper towel, it's very textured, so it will leave little textures in your paint as well. So what I'm going to do is, even though that's such a small area, I'm actually going to just hit that with the heat tool to dry that off, just so I can avoid any of those watercolor ruffles again. So I'm just going to pause the video while I dry it. If you had a larger sky area, another thing you could do is, if it was too late to get rid of those cauliflower sort of ruffles, what you could do is you could use that texture to your advantage and add some things like clouds in the sky if you wanted to have, if you want to add that in. If you wanted a straight wash where you just wanted the sky one colour, then you'd have to sort of redo it or paint over it. But if you went and decided to try and use the mistake to an advantage, then you can turn them into clouds. You can lift some of the colour away. You can go at the area with a clean water damp brush and then lift some of that excess paint away with some paper towel, make some cloud textures. So the next thing I'm going to do here, now that I've established my little sky and horizon line here, I'm going to at an angle, very lightly, I'm holding the end of my pencil back here, and I'm just going to draw in where I want my shoreline, sort of we go from water to sand here. And the other thing that's in the photo reference is this is like wet sand in here, and this is dry sand up the top, and there's some grass peeking out through the sand. So just as a little guide to myself, you probably can't even really see that on the camera. It's very light. I don't want it very dark because most of that area is very light in colour, and with watercolour, as it's translucent, you're going to see those lines through it. So I just want to have it very light. It's just a guide for myself. Okay. So the next thing I'm going to do is with that flat brush again, and I'm actually going to use that Prussian blue again, but more paint, less water this time. Still a little bit of water to help it flow, but I want a bolder colour because the water itself is darker towards the top there. I'm just going to try and go all the way across and put in that dark blue, kind of so I have a somewhat straight line. Now the other thing I like about painting the ocean is, and painting water in general, I guess, is that there are so many reflections on the water. So you can, again, if you can't get a nice even wash, you can use those textures that appear either from the paper or the application of paint to your advantage to add in some reflections. So this water starts out dark at the top towards the sky in the photograph, and then it sort of becomes more aqua as it comes forward. So to do that, I'm going to continue using my Prussian blue, but I'm going to mix in some of my cool yellow. So I'm going to have my Prussian blue. I'm going to keep a pool of the Prussian blue here, but next to it in a separate mix, I'm going to add in some of that yellow. And that's a fine balance. You just need to mix the colours until you're happy with them, if you think they look right. So I had a little bit too much yellow, so I've just had to add some more of my Prussian blue in and darken it up a little bit. Okay. I'm actually kind of drawing this in little sketchy lines too, like I'm not sort of going neatly back and forth. I'm sort of sidling the brush from side to side so that I can force some of that texture in. Even if it kind of evens itself out a little bit, there's still a little bit of texture in there. So it gives the impression of sort of ripples or waves in the water. It's actually not very often that I use a flat brush, so this is kind of new to me. So the other thing I noticed in my reference is that there are some darker parts in the water. So I'm going to add some of those in, and that's just with straight Prussian blue that I'm doing that. You notice how I'm leaving these little white parts in here. I don't know if you can see that very well there. There we go. Just by you doing those sketchy lines back and forth, I'm able to leave some white of the paper, and even if they're not necessarily in my reference, that just adds to the look of the painting, so that there's reflections on the water. So this is where we can veer away from the reference and put our own spin on things. You don't have to do that. You can follow the reference as you please. When we get down to where the water is sort of crashing onto the beach, we've got some white parts of the sort of sea foam. There are a couple of ways that we can do this. We can use the white of the paper, which is what I plan to do today. So I'm basically going to paint around it and leave the white of the paper. For other techniques, if I was doing something really detailed where I wanted, I've done a painting like that in the past, where it's basically focusing, the focal point of the painting is that part of the beach where the water is coming onto the sand, and you've got all the little ripples and bubbles and whites of the water. You could use masking fluid for that. You need to plan that ahead of time though, where you paint in with your masking fluid where you want the whites, and you keep them white, and you can paint around it, and then you can remove the masking fluid once everything's dry and you've preserved that white of your paper. Or you could use something like white gouache. Sometimes I do a mix of the two, so I might use this today as well. If I do, I'll link that as well, or at least list it in the description, should I say. So I'm going to just continue adding in the water in the distance here. Continuing using that sidling sort of motion. Don't even know if that's really the right term, but I'm sticking with it. So I'm using that same mix of the cool yellow and the Prussian blue again as we come forward a bit, and there's quite a bit more water in it this time. I'm probably going to go over the top part here as well. So it's not dark enough for my liking for this piece. I think the most important advice I can give to beginners is really just to take your time with the painting. Watercolour, sometimes you do need to work quickly, especially if you want nice smooth blends, but that's something you can sort of practice with time. I think sometimes we put a lot of pressure on ourselves that we think that we should just be able to paint something really quickly or replicate something really quickly. So my biggest piece of advice is just to take your time with it, and not just with each individual painting, but with your journey. If you're starting out with watercolor, just to be kind to yourself, give yourself the time to learn the skills, and even if the piece is a failure, don't look at it like it's a failure. Look at it like you've learned something, because to this day, I've been painting for a very long time, but to this day I can look at paintings and know that I've learned something with each piece I've created. And I'll also be very critical of myself and know that I see flaws or mistakes and things in each piece. Even if I'm happy with how it turned out, there's still things I could pick about it that I am not fond of or that I could have improved on. But I think the most important thing is to not compare yourself to anyone else, just compare yourself to your own journey and look back at stuff that you've done previously and know how far you've come. Just put the time in, give yourself the time, and be kind to yourself, basically. So this was a little bit of wet into wet along here, because I went in with my yellow and blue mix, and it was a little bit lighter, and I've added in some of the Prussian blue underneath that, and it's doing these little fuzzy bits in here. Not sure if you can see that. So I'm going to paint over that because I don't necessarily want those textures in my water because they're going vertically. So when you're layering, if you're like me, you get a bit too impatient and you want to sort of keep painting, it's important to stop and dry in between if you want to go in and add more colours. Or the paper needs to be at least semi-dry so that it doesn't bleed out like that. What I'll do is I'll actually go back and work on this instead of stopping to dry. So I'm going to go back in with my bold Prussian blue mix, so more paint to water. It's one of my favourite things about watercolour is that there's so much versatility to it, especially with your colours, because you can water down the paint or use it as a bold mix. And if you've got nice quality paints that have a lot of pigment to them, you can get a wide range of sort of tones throughout that one colour. So if you use that Prussian blue on its own, that can look almost black with sort of minimal amount of water to it, right down to like this. These two colours are exactly the same colour, the sky and this water, but there's a lot more water mixed in with this to do the sky. So they look like two different colours. Or at least tones. Having the sky and the water at the top there be two different colours, or two different tones, helps add that contrast. We've got the sky and then we've got the water. There's a bold contrast there. But by using the same colour as in Prussian blue, we create sort of uniformity to the painting. So we really won't use many colours for this piece. And I'm going to mix so I don't have this sort of bold line between the dark blue and this green mix here. I am going to subtly add in some of that Prussian blue throughout, just using that sort of dabbing side kind of motion. Doesn't need to be perfect, don't fuss with it too much. One good thing you can do is if you hold your brush further back, it gives you less control, so you can get more variation in your brush strokes. And you get a more organic look. Okay, I'm going to leave this for now and let it dry a little bit more. So I'm going to come forward a little bit. And this is when the water really starts to get more of that nice aqua colour to it. So I'm going to add in a little bit more of my yellow in with my Prussian blue. And I'm using a fair amount of water here too. And I'm also going to leave some white of the paper. To say we've sort of got where that sea foam is on top. I've left more than I need to. That's because it's easier to add in than it is to take away if you want to preserve the white of your paper. As I said, you could use masking fluid to do this as well, if you have that. On the paper itself, I'm going to sort of mix in some of that yellow on the paper directly with the paint. And I'm also bringing my paintbrush down in this kind of stroke here because the wave is coming down like this. Using some of my darker yellow and Prussian blue mix towards the edges here. So I've got some of this bloom here because I had a bit too much water. So I'm going to add in a bit more paint. I'm dabbing at the paper here so I can leave some of this white and have some kind of that there's a lot going on in that sea foam. I'm not going to replicate everything in perfect detail because this is supposed to be a fairly quick painting. But that will just help me indicate some of that sea foam. So I'm not going to fuss with it too much. I've added a bit too much paint there, so what I'm doing is I'm dabbing away with some clean water and a damp brush some of that colour. I didn't actually want all that dark to come around to the front here. So while this is wet, I'm actually going to pause the video here and dry my paper again because I don't want to risk mixing and bleeding the paint together here. Okay, now that I've dried that, a quick way to check is you can use the back of your hand to feel the paper. If it feels cool, it's still a bit damp, so just be mindful if your paper is still wet. You might get some sort of, I've even got a little bit of the cauliflower watercolour in here. Again, I'm not going to worry too much about it. What I'm going to do is I'm going to leave a bit of a white gap here and start working on my sand now. And for that, I'm going to use some yellow ochre. Mine is a Burgundy yellow ochre. That's because they didn't have any yellow ochre in stock when I went to buy it, but the colour is fairly similar, so I'm just going with that. So I'm going to add in some of that yellow ochre mix. Again, I'm going to leave a bit of a white gap. And this is also wet on to dry. I didn't wet this first. Now the other thing that is happening in the photo here, but because of the aspect ratio, I'm kind of running out of room a little bit. There is where the sand is a bit more wet. So we have a bit of a colour variation there as well. So it's wet here, but then there's these sort of reflections from the sky here. So what we can do is mix in a very watered down version of our Prussian blue. And I'm going to blend that out with just some clean water. This probably seems very out of place on the sand, but because the sand is wet, it's reflecting the colour of the sky. I don't want to go too crazy with it because it will look a little bit out of place. I'm going to go back in with my yellow ochre. This is fairly watered down as well. I also want to be careful not to mix it too much because it will create a kind of green colour, so just be mindful of that. And to darken up this yellow ochre, I'm actually going to mix in a tiny bit of burnt umber. I'd considered the burnt sienna, but has a little bit more warmth to it, a bit more red tones to it. I want this to be fairly cool. So, and while it's still wet, doing this wet into wet blending, I'm going to mix in and let the water do the work for blending. I'm actually going to go right up to the top of where I started painting in the sand, because it just helps blend out those colours a little bit more. But also I want to use more yellow ochre for the drier sand up the top here. So a yellow ochre on its own with more water towards the top. I'm not worried about too much in the way of details here, because I'm going to add some of that grass into this sand. And I'll use my Sap Green to do that. Okay. So now that I've blocked that in, as it's at the bottom, I'm actually going to dry this again as well, and I'm probably going to go over my blue with a bit of my yellow ochre just to even it out a little bit, because it does look a bit like that's actually straight water in there and not sand that's reflecting water. So the sand would be underneath that water, so the water is reflecting the sky where we've got those blue tones, but underneath that we have the sand, so it wouldn't be straight blue like this. So what I'm going to do is dry and then go over that with some yellow ochre. Okay, that's all dry now. Before I go down towards the bottom, because I tend to work sort of top to bottom as best I can so that I don't put my hand in wet paint, I'm going to go back up and work towards the top before going over this part again. So I'm actually going to go right up into this part of the water that I'd left before, and I'm going to use my Prussian blue and cool yellow mix, so my aqua kind of colour, and I'm going to, using that same motion, add that paint in. The nice thing about having added in this wash of this cool colour, it's not leaving straight white, so we get a little bit more variation. So we still have the white to show our bright reflections, as the water often has, even though they're not very prominent in this painting. Again, that's artistic license, you can change it up as you like. If you have a little bit too much water on your brush, if you've got like a very watered down mix of paint, like I do just over here, and it's a little bit too much water, what you can do is you can use that paper towel just to take away some of that excess water. So not all of your paint, but just to take away some of that water. So I've just gone in and added a bit more of that aqua, and I'll go in and add more Prussian blue down here now. I don't want it too dark. I'm sorry if you can hear that outside, my neighbours are doing some gardening, I think. Rough watercolour paper is a really good paper to use for landscapes. Because there's a lot of texture in the paper, you can let that texture do some of the work for you as well. This isn't a rough paper, this is a cold press paper, so it's like a medium texture. So there is some texture to it, but it's not like a full rough, as rough watercolour paper is. But I'm using what texture there is in this paper as well. So this is basically just building your layers. Everyone approaches sort of landscapes or their painting a bit differently, so this is just the way I do things. If something works better for you, by all means, go ahead and do that. But I wanted to sort of do these sorts of videos, especially for beginners or anyone sort of intermediate skills, if they haven't done landscapes before or they want to try out different things. I want these videos to be helpful and just to give some basic tips and ideas on how to approach things, and then that way you can try something new if this is new to you, or learn a new skill, or even try something and then adapt it to your own way of doing things. So I'm going to take away some of this white now because it's not that much white in my reference here. I don't have to follow it exactly as I said before, but another nice thing we can do underneath the white, even though this also isn't really in my reference, but I want to add it in, is we get like a little bit of shadow underneath that white. So we can add a bit of a shadow line underneath there with our Prussian blue mix. And just using clean water to blend it out. I don't want to go too far down because I've got this nice highlight in here, so I don't want to lose that. Just using a little bit more of that Prussian blue again. Also, by adding the darker part, sort of where that sort of wave is coming in, having it darker towards the sides also helps make that even brighter. Okay. So with a very watered down mix of that Prussian blue, very watered down, I'm going to just add a little bit towards the bottom of that highlighted area there. So where I've got my white of the wave here, I'm actually going to switch brushes now to a number 4 round. So with a round brush we can sort of flatten it out so we get a nice broad stroke, or we can use more control by holding the brush closer towards the tip and you're using just the tip of the brush to do fine lines or finer lines. So that's why a round brush is pretty good to use, or probably one of the best brushes to use when it comes to watercolour. I'm going to use some burnt umber. Just kind of watered down, I don't want it too dark. And I'm just sort of, I dabbed off a bit of excess and I'm just picking it up with the tip of the brush here. And I'm going to go into this part of the sand and kind of try and add in a bit of shadow, and I'm going to come up into the white because the water's sort of crashing onto the shore there, and I'm dabbing it in like little dots. Kind of adding a little bit more of the burnt umber as I go in, but there's a particular shadow towards the left side here. And I'm just using a bit of a wet brush to kind of blend out the little hard edges a little bit. Okay. And with a very, very watered down version of the yellow ochre and a bit of that burnt umber mix, I'm going to just a really tiny amount of paint. I'm going to add in some, just break up that white. And I'm kind of drawing in like the motion that the wave's making here in my reference. Just kind of dabbing it in. I'm really sorry if that noise in the background is really loud. This microphone picks up stuff pretty well, so I'm hoping it's not terrible for you. Now towards this part here, I'm going to use some of the aqua mix, so the Prussian blue and the yellow, to add in some of that variation at the top. This is all just really sort of subtle marks at this stage, but they're the tiny details that help sort of fill in the gaps for your brain when you're looking at an image. So it tells you what you're looking at. One of my favourite things about landscapes is a lot about an indication. Just giving the impression of something. As I go through the painting, I'm sort of jumping around and I see things that I need to fix. So I'm just sort of going back in with a bit of Prussian blue here just to darken this part of the, the water up. So sorry if I jump around a bit too much. You'll develop your own style when you paint. I think a lot of painters do this though, where they jump around a bit. Some people I've seen that just work section by section, and they do such an amazing job where they say they're painting a portrait or something and they can just feel, you know, they'll have the eye painted perfectly and then the other eye is painted perfectly and then the skin, and I can't always do that, or I don't often do that, because sometimes, especially when you're trying to get an understanding of colour and things like that, it's sometimes hard to know your value. So these people very clearly know their colours and their value range, and yeah, they just blow my mind. So we do have a bit more of that sandy colour in the water, in the sea foam spray stuff up here. Again, just adding little dots. I don't want it too dark, so I'm just sort of dabbing off some of that excess paint and picking up some clean water to blend it out again. Because because we don't really want it to be completely stark white, because it's not that way in real life. But I also don't want to go too far, because then I don't want to lose that white, because there is actual white in this painting. White's a very tricky thing when you're painting, because there are so many shades to it and so many little subtle variations. So it's usually lots of mixtures of light tones, so greys and creams and that kind of thing. You've got these really light versions of that, and then the only real white in a painting generally should be the truest highlight. So now I'm going to go back over that blue that we added in here. I'm actually going to wet that area just with a bit of water first, because I don't want to go too crazy and lose that colour. And I'm going to use my same mix that I had before with that yellow ochre and burnt umber, and I'm going to paint over the top like that. Now I've got a bit of a darker line here, but what I'm going to do, because I can see some lines in the sand, is I'm going to just draw in, paint in, just using that same mix. It'll fade back a bit too, and just breaking up that sand a bit there. I'm trying not to get too caught up in the details as we're going along here. So I'm going to pause the video and dry this again. Now this is dry, but I actually want to do another glaze of that yellow ochre and burnt umber mix, because I was trying not to go too dark and I didn't. It wasn't enough to cover it, so I'm going to do another glaze over the top. And what I'll do is I'll actually, hopefully to try and even out some of this, I'll glaze over the entire lot. So sometimes these things are a fine balance, and you just need to slowly build your way up. So you don't go, because with watercolour it is a little bit difficult to remove, so it's easier to go from light to dark, building your layers from sometimes. And I'm going to go back to my flat brush here. Okay. So while that's drying, I'm going to move on to this dry part of the sand here. I'm going to be adding in some green of the little grass bits, but in the sand I'm going to pop in some shadow shapes, and I'm going to use a darker mix of that yellow ochre and just pop in some shadowy shapes, and this will help me decide where to place my grass. So basically kind of glazing in this colour. So glazing, if you don't know what that is where you are basically adding another layer of paint onto the top of a established layer already, and it's usually watered down, so it helps you can sort of tint other colors. So you might have, say you're painting a flower and you've got a pink petal, you might want to glaze a bit of a more orange color to bring a bit of warmth to it or something like that, or you're glazing a bit of yellow where the sun's hitting it or something like that. So that's basically what I was doing here, is glazing the sand color back over that blue color so that I could sort of even it out and warm up that cool blue that we'd added in earlier. Okay, so while I'm just going to have a bit of a think about if there's anything else I want to be doing before I start adding in this grass. I think I might want to take away some more of that white up here. So I'm going to mix up some more of my Prussian blue and my cool yellow. In the description, what I'll do is I'll list the colours that I've used in this painting. You don't have to use these exact colours, but what I'll do is I'll list some alternatives as well. So there's something you might have in your palette already, or something that's more accessible to you in a different brand, and hopefully that will help. So I've mixed up, this is actually leading more towards a green with the Prussian blue and the cool yellow, and I'm just going to dab in some of that colour and take away some of that white. Just there. And continuing down here. This isn't following the reference exactly. I'm trying to follow it sort of as best I can, but sometimes you need to adapt and make changes if you've got your aspect ratio might be a little bit different to what your reference is, what your paper is. This paper is 6 inches by 9 inches, so I was just using what I had and I wanted to try out this paper. What I'm going to do is I'm going to use my glazing again, but towards the top here. This is still wet, so I'm going to try not to put my hand in it. If you're worried, just let it dry, or dry it with a hairdryer or a heat tool, whatever you have. So with glazing, something you want to be careful about too is, it's alright if this is where we talked earlier about high staining colours, so like the phthalo blue is a fairly staining colour, so it can be difficult to lift out. But it might play to your advantage if you want to glaze over the top of it, because one thing we need to be careful about when we use watercolour with glazing is you don't want to scrub at the area too much, because it will start to lift the paint that you've already put down. Even if it's dry, it's not going to be permanent. So we need to be careful. I've got my nice little lines in here that are sort of creating those ripple effects in the water. I don't want to lose those, so I don't want to dab or scrub too much of that area. I kind of just want to lightly go over it, just basically adding that colour in. I don't want to disturb the paint underneath too much, so I'm just going to go in very gently, sort of dab it in. So again, I'm just using my cool yellow and Prussian blue to create my green. This yellow is a very sort of opaque yellow, it's not very translucent. So I'm using a fair amount of water to water it down too for my glaze. And dabbing off some of that water out of my brush onto my paper towel. Okay, sorry, my battery just needed to be replaced. Okay, so I'm just going to continue with my glazing that I was doing just before. And this is where you could, I'm mixing it up a little bit here, varying away from the reference by adding a bit more of my green towards the middle here. And I'm going to mix in a little bit more of that Prussian blue. Just blending it out. So to get a soft blend, we do sort of the wet into wet technique, which is what I've got going on here a little bit, and what I used for the sand here. So you could wet the paper first and then go in with your paint. When you want more control and you want lines to show, or you're working in a smaller area, you don't necessarily need to do a sort of wet into wet blending technique. That's when we work wet paint onto dry paper. So that's what we talk about when you hear the terms wet into wet or wet onto dry. Quite a bit of water on this paper here. You probably can't really tell from there, but I can see little waves like this in the paper. So once it dries, some of that should go. But it can make it difficult when you're working on it. So if you're trying to have a bit more control over a certain area and you don't want to be dealing with that, what you can do is, again, just dry the paper. Some other tips you can try is to use a watercolor block where the watercolor pad is sealed at all edges, or you could stretch the paper first. I have never done that myself, but I understand that you can basically you're submerging the paper into like a bathtub or a dish or something of water. So the paper is sort of stretched to its max capacity because it's completely, the whole thing's wet basically. And then you use a gummed tape to seal all the edges and then let it dry, and it'll be tight as a drum because it's been stretched. I'm going to dry this again now and I'll be back in a second. Okay, now paper's all dry again. I'm going to go back to my round brush and I am going to pop in a few more of my shadows underneath the wave there, and I'm going to use more of my burnt umber, this time more on its own. I want this to be a darker colour or bolder colour so we can, because this is a stronger shadow underneath this part of the wave here. You could fuss with this until the cows come home. With details, you can make this as detailed or as not detailed as you like. I'm going sort of for a in-between look today. I'm trying not to get too caught up in every tiny detail because I just wanted this to be a quick painting, something hopefully manageable for beginners. Don't want to fuss with it too much. And I'm just using a bit more water to lighten down some of the shades. I don't want it to be a uniform colour of shadow all the way along, because there are bolder shadows here and then more subtle shadows elsewhere. So again, that's where we can use our water control to change our colours a little bit. And I'm actually going to follow this shadow all the way along the line here. Okay. I'm kind of just skipping my brush along using that surface of the paper. I'm going to mix more of that water in to that brown burnt umber mix, and just to put a bit of texture into that sand. Okay. So one thing I'm noticing here now that I've popped in some more of those shadows and darkened up this part of the beach, that this part is lighter than I really wanted it to be. So it's not the white of the paper because we added our yellow ochre mix in before, but it almost looks completely white now that we've added in our bolder colours around it. So I need to add in a bit more of that yellow ochre. Over the top of this part of the sandbank. I'm going back to my flat brush. You could use a larger round. I just want to cover in this area a little bit quicker than I can with my tiny number 4 round here. And this is kind of glazing again because it's not disturbing the shadows that we added in earlier too much. And again, I'm not too concerned about that either because we're going to be adding some grass over the top of that. So now that's just filled in that that colour a little bit more, and that also puts our whites that are in the water back in. They're bolder white now again because it was kind of competing a bit too much. So I'm just going to dry that one more time and start adding in the grass. Okay, now that's all dry, I'm going to use my round brush now, and Sap Green I'm going to use for my grass. As I was saying before about sort of fussing with details, like I said, you could make this as detailed as you wanted or as loose as you wanted as well. It depends on your painting style. Another thing you can do is don't be afraid to mix your mediums. If you wanted, you could use some coloured pencils to add your grass in. if you're worried about sort of brush control or anything like that. What I'm doing is adding in my blades of grass here, and I'm starting towards the bottom where the sand is, sorry, so you can see, and I'm flicking the brush up to have the brush stroke taper as it goes towards the top, so it makes it look more like grass. Don't worry about them being too perfect, because this is a case where we don't want perfection. We want variation in the size of the grass, in the thickness of the lines, to create a more natural look. Because in nature, nothing is really symmetrical. If it was a perfectly manicured garden, then that would be a different story. But this is grass that's growing through the sand on the beach. There's going to be different sort of clumps of grass together, and none of them are going to look the same. So, and I'm trying to use some of these shadows that I established earlier. And I'm not, for this, I'm not copying the reference exactly. I've got it here in front of me to sort of look up at occasionally, but I'm really not following it to a T or anything like that. You can if you want to, by all means, of course. But I think that's the beauty of landscapes, is that you don't need to make it look exact, because it's not like a portrait of a person that you are trying to paint. There are certain features that make, distinguish someone. So you want, in that case, that's where you really would want to use a reference and follow it pretty much exactly, because you want the person to look like them. Whereas with a landscape like this, you don't need to worry too much about that, because you're just putting in the indication. A blade of grass, it's just a green line, really. Sometimes what I like to do with a painting is sort of once I've finished it, or I think it looks finished, is to walk away from it, and you can come back and fuss with it a bit more, or add in a few more details. You could go in and start adding your details with your coloured pencils or more paint or whatever you want to do. Sometimes just walking away, even for an hour, go and have your lunch or dinner or whatever it is, or even a couple of days, it helps sort of refresh and give your brain and your eyes a new perspective on your painting. I may not sort of do that with this painting today. I think I'll just leave it as it is. But if you're working on this, by all means, you can do that. Give yourself a break, give your eyes a break, and come back to it when you've had a rest and your eyes are nice and fresh, and you can look at it again. What I will do is I want to add in a few more details for the water, and that's where I am either going to use some white gouache or a white gel pen. That is something that I didn't mention at the start of the video. I will list it in whatever I use in the description. But just to add in a few more of those details of the water, I'm going to start with a white gel pen. This is a Uniball Signo Broad. I really like this particular gel pen, but whatever white gel pen you can find. Now I don't want to smudge my little grass, so I'm just going to try and be careful. So I can go in and draw in some more of those. I kind of, particularly here towards the top of this wave, I didn't leave that white earlier, so I can go in and add some white now. And you can kind of dot it, like sort of dab at your page to create some little dots of the white. So we've got those sort of random sprays of water where it's sort of foaming up a little bit. I apologise if these aren't all the correct terms. You could also, if you're using a different reference that might have all those sort of little white lines through the water, you could draw those in with a white gel pen. There are some, if you really zoom in to this, to the reference. I was trying not to do that. Like I said, I didn't want to get caught up too much in all those details. And I'm just sort of using sort of scribbly lines to add in some of that white. It's something that's sort of more subtle, and you probably won't even really notice it unless you're looking really close at the photo. So just be careful about or just be mindful of the amount of details that you want to add in to your painting, because sometimes, especially if it's a small painting or something that's going to be, or even a big painting, something that's going to be hanging on a wall, a lot of people are going to be looking at it from a distance. It's only, you could be putting in all these really tiny details that someone's only going to notice if they're looking so close at it. So, sometimes it's the groundwork of the painting is done all in the beginning when you're establishing all your values. That's the most important part really of the painting. The details is just the kind of icing on the cake, the fun part. So that's why I think that getting caught up in or worrying too much about the details to start off with is something that you shouldn't really concern yourself with. Don't stress yourself about it, because that's stuff to worry about more towards the end, and more if you want to. It's the most important parts is getting your shapes right and your contrast right. Your tonal value is the thing that's going to sell the painting basically as the image, if that makes any sense. So basically I'm just going to keep drawing in these little little white highlights and lines and stuff that I want to add in. Again, not following the reference too closely. I'm adding stuff in that's not even in the photo reference myself. And like I said, some of this might not even be coming up on the camera that well. Because it's such sort of fine details. So when I'm adding in this white gel pen, or if I was using white gouache or something like that, the parts that are already white here, obviously going over white with white is not going to do anything. It's already established that white for you. So if you wanted to break up the white of the water here, you actually need to go in and add your darker tones underneath it, and then sort of paint over the top with the white, or draw over the top with a white gel pen, whichever you're doing. So that's another way you could do it, as I was saying before about using masking fluid or something like that to preserve your whites. I just sort of painted around it today, but sometimes it's easier to have, maybe even if you painted that all in sort of a grey and then go over with the white or something like that. It really comes down to personal preference, what works best for you, what supplies you have on hand. If you don't have masking fluid, or you don't have white gel pen or white gouache, you just sort of need to work with what you have there. So hopefully I've given some good tips in this video for you. Hopefully it's helpful to you, or even if you take, you know, one thing away from it, I hope that's beneficial. I'm going to call this done. I'm going to stop fussing with it now, because I think I'll be here all day if I keep fussing at it. You absolutely could. You could keep going in and adding more shadow, more depth, more details, more highlights, whatever you want until you're happy with the piece. But for me, I'm pretty happy with this. So I'm going to remove my masking tape now. One thing I did want to do, wanted to talk about in removing the masking tape, was to give you a little tip here. Sometimes with masking tape, it can have stuck a little bit too well to your paper and can pull away or tear away at your paper, and you probably don't want that. So some tips: I like to pull the masking tape back basically on itself like this. If it starts to offer any real resistance, it's probably stuck a little bit too well. And what you can do is you can use your hairdryer or your heat tool and sort of dry or go over the area. And what that does is it helps loosen some of that adhesive so that it doesn't, so that it can sort of pull away. That's one thing to be mindful of when you're painting though. However, if you're using something to dry your paper, it can start to lift away your tape a little bit. So you just be mindful of that. Just press it back down while you're painting if you want to preserve your nice white borders, or you might need to add a bit more tape if it's removed it too much. But that is a good tip just to help remove your masking tape without any issues. So far this seems okay. I've had paintings in the past where all of it will remove perfectly fine, and then just one tiny little bit that won't. So the other thing is make sure that your paper is completely dry before you start removing masking fluid or masking tape, because that will definitely cause some issues for you. It needs to be completely dry before you go ahead and remove. So that's another thing. If you are using masking fluid, just factor that into your time that you've set aside for painting, because it does take a while to dry, and you need it definitely to be dry before you start painting, and the paint around it needs to be dry before you remove the masking fluid as well. So anyway, if you have any questions, please feel free to leave them down in the comments below. I'm always up for answering questions or offering some advice if you need any. And don't forget to hit like and subscribe if you want to see more content from me. Your feedback is really important to me to know whether to continue doing these videos or any other videos that I do on my channel. And overall, just enjoy your painting. I hope you give this a try if you want to. Have a lovely day. I'll see you in the next video. Bye.